Let me start by thanking Professor Smith for this invitation. It would have been really wonderful to also be able to be there and interact with you in person, but in the age of the coronavirus, we have to adjust. It's also very moving for me to give the Joseph Miller lecture. I started my academic career at the University of Nottingham, where I also joined, as Professor Smith mentioned, ISOS, the Institute for the Study of Slavery, which fostered collaboration between slavery specialists between different periods, different areas, and different disciplines. Joe Miller was, if he didn't attend every single one of the ISOS biennial conferences, he attended most of them. He was a very important member of ISOS, and of course, his call to historicize the study of slavery, to move beyond thinking of slavery in static, essentialist terms, and to think in terms of processes and strategies, was particularly powerful to all those who participated in the ISOS conferences, and it had a deep impact on me as well. So I think it's very opposite to give today's lecture, which I hope will be some kind of processionalist approach to slave identity as part of a Joseph Miller memorial lecture. Now, over the last 30 years, the issue of identity has become one of the major topics of the modern humanities and social sciences. Whether we look at history or anthropology or sociology and the rest of the human sciences, there has been an enormous output, both of theoretical reflections about identity and in-depth studies of various aspects of identity. And that, of course, applies also in regards to the ancient world. When it comes to ethnic identities, cultural identities, religious identities, gender identities, over the last 30 years, an enormous output of work on identity has been done in these areas of ancient history. But when it comes down specifically to the study of slavery, I would argue things are completely different. In fact, there has been extremely little work on slave identity in particular. That's not something that can be encountered in the global study of slavery. In fact, our colleagues in early modern and modern slaveries over the last 20 or 30 years have been engaged in a very fascinating discussion about the various forms of identity in the shadow of slavery, as some of them have called, or creolization, or all sorts of other debates about the role of the identities of enslaved persons. For various reasons, which I'm not going to address, this discussion has yet to attract sufficient attention in the study of ancient slaveries. So what I hope to do today is to try to raise some issues that a discussion of slave identities should deal with. I will purposely try to avoid focusing on examples and try to present an overall framework. I will give some examples by trying to illustrate some aspects, but in general, my focus is on presenting a framework. We can discuss the specifics to the extent that you find them worth discussing in the discussion. I should start by saying that slavery is, of course, an imposed identity. It's an identity that is imposed on certain people, and that, of course, has quite crucial implications. And the point of this paper is to consider the implications of the fact that slavery is an imposed identity. But we also need to engage, I think, with a wider literature on identity and at the contributions of historians as well as social scientists, and see what implications this work has on the study of slave identities, or better, as the identities of enslaved persons, as I would try to argue towards the end of this paper, in particular. So, Let me start by a first point about modes of identification. We can broadly say that there are two different modes of identification. The first mode of identification is categorical. Basically, people are identified by belonging to particular categories. French speakers, people with blue eyes, Christian, Jews, or Muslims. But there is a second form of identification, which is relational. And kinship is probably the best example of a relational mode of identification in which your identity is not so much based on things you share with others, but on your relations with others, ancestors, descendants, relatives, and so on and so forth. Now, slavery partakes of both modes of identification. Slave identity can be based on a categorical mode of identification because slaves share particular features that make them members of a single category. I will come back to that, but the two most famous definitions, if you want, of the category of slave is slavery as property and slavery as social death, but I will come back to that later. But it's important also to emphasize that slave identity can be based on a relational mode of identification. Most slaves are slaves of a particular master, and therefore the relationship with a particular master can in fact become a particularly important mode of identification. In fact, there are slave-holding societies, both in parts of the world, like for example Southeast Asia, as well as in certain parts of the ancient world, as I will try to argue later in the paper, where the relational mode of identification is particularly strong, particularly important. What matters more in those circumstances is the particular relationship between a specific master and a specific slave, rather than the overall categorical content of the categorical mode of identification. So we will need to talk about categories, and we will need to talk about relationships if we want to understand slave identities. And I will start with relationships before moving to categories. Using again the sociological and anthropological literature, we can make a first distinction between direct and indirect relationships. Direct relationships are relationships that bring two or more people in direct contact. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of slaves in global history have been part of direct relationships with their masters as well as other people. But in certain circumstances and for certain societies, slaves have also been part of indirect relationships. In these cases, there's no direct contact, no direct relationship between two or more people, but there is mediation between different levels of people. To give a particular modern example, think of large-scale modern organizations like states and governments, like business corporations, like churches. There are direct relationships between people at different levels, but hardly any people have direct relationships with a pope or with a prime minister or with a head, a CEO of a corporation. People who are part of those organizations, employees of a company, civil servants, or priests might have direct relationships with other people, but they are interlinked with lower and higher levels of people through indirect relationships. This is particularly important, for example, for certain forms of slavery, like the very large portfolios of slave ownership in the Roman world. Simply think about the Trimalchio's description of the multiple estates he owned and the tens or hundreds of slaves in those places, or think of Melania the Younger and the purportedly thousands of slaves that she owned in various provinces of the Roman Empire. In those cases, the direct relationship with a master was very limited, and it was in fact a linkage, a network of indirect relationships through various media that linked slaves with their masters. But in the overwhelming majority of cases, it is in fact the direct relationships with their masters and with other people, other slaves, other free people that were particularly important for slaves. Now, the next distinction is between primary and secondary relationships. Now, primary relationships are relationships in which basically all particular aspects, features, roles, and characteristics of individuals affect and matter for a particular relationships. The relations between friends, the relations between spouses, relationships between lovers, are relationships or relations between parents and children, as a matter of fact, are relationships in which all particular features matter. On the contrary, secondary relationships are relationships which are determined by specified features of a particular role. To give one example, my relationship to the postman or to the policeman are secondary relationships because they're based on our particular features in our particular roles as postman and receiver of parcels and so on and so forth. But the stronger the relationships are, and the stronger the direct relations between individuals are, the more it is the case that secondary relationships might in fact become assimilated to primary relationships. In theory, my relationships to my colleagues and to my students are secondary relationships shaped by our particular roles as colleagues or as students and teachers. In practice, with some of my colleagues and some of my students, our relationships might be more assimilated to primary relationships than to secondary. Now, of course, the relationship between a slave and a master is, of course, a secondary relationship, shaped by the peculiar roles of masters and slaves. But in fact, because most of these relationships are direct, in the process of time, they will tend to be assimilated in one way or the other to primary relationships. I want to give a first example which shows the implications, but also the complexities and contradictions of this aspect. I give you a text here from Oxyrhynchus in Roman Egypt, in which Thermotharion, the slave owner, is basically filing a petition to complain against the injuries that a certain person, as a fact a slave, inflicted on her own female slave called Peina, particularly interesting name. As part of her description, she says the following: I loved and took care of my serving girl, Peina, a homebred slave, as though my own little daughter, in the hope that when she came of age, I would have her to nourish me in my old age, since I am a woman who is helpless and alone. I think it's quite evident here how the petitioner has chosen to present her relationship to her homebred slave as a primary relationship. It is, of course, equally telling that there is a utilitarian explanation of this assimilation. It's because she hopes that the slave would support her in her old age. In fact, we know from the rest of the petition that the slave was injured while going to have singing classes. And given the strong associations between singing and the sex industry in antiquity, it's not impossible to assume here that basically the slave was trained in a profession in which her sexual exploitation would support her elderly owner in her everyday life. I think it's a good example which shows both aspects of slavery as a primary and as a secondary relationship at the same time. So it's important to remember that one of the aspects that matter for slave identities was the effort to assimilate what was in theory a secondary relationship into a primary relationship, with all the disadvantages and advantages that that would bring for both slaves and masters. And now come to the two categories, the other basis on which slave identification took place. Now, categories can, of course, be definitional, the typical Aristotelian concept of categories. A senator is somebody who is defined as senator because he or she fulfills certain criteria, and this definitional mode of this definitional way of this definitional form of categories is usually exclusive. You either belong to this category or you do not belong. But as cognitive scientists have realized more and more over the last few decades, not all categories are definitional. Many categories and the ways that human beings employ them are in fact what cognitive science called prototypical categories. Most human beings do not define a bird by trying to create a definition of what a bird is. In fact, what they do is that they take a best case or a prototype, a robin, for example, which in their mind is the prototypical case of what a bird is, and judge the rest of birds or the rest of animals on the basis, on the extent to which they are identical or similar to that prototypical case. How does this apply to slavery? Now, of course, slavery can be a definitional category, as I mentioned before. Slavery as property is, I think, the quintessential example of slavery as a definitional category. The problem with definitional categories, though, is that although they are quite clear because they tend to be exclusive, you either are a slave or you are not, is that they often tend to be invisible in everyday social interaction. You need to know that somebody is the property of somebody else in order to be able to categorize that person as a slave. In practice, most societies, at the same time that they construct definitional categories, they also construct prototypical categories, creating prototypes of what a slave should look like, should be like, including features like bodily features, clothing, ways of behaving, ethical characteristics, and so on and so forth. And they use these prototypical categories in order to categorize people and in order to interact with people categorized in one way or the other. For most lay people and non-specialists, the prototypical image of an African slave in New World societies is how they usually understand what a slave is like. And that's why they're often surprised when they come across categories of slaves that do not easily fit this particular prototype. Now, the problem with prototypical categories is that they are very useful for interaction because they are immediately identifiable. But of course, they create their own problems because you can have slaves who do not easily fit the prototype of what a slave should look like or should behave like. And of course, there can equally be free people or groups of free people who fit the prototypical image of slaves to a bigger or smaller degree. So most societies have both definitional categories of slaves, but also prototypical categories, and each of them creates its own problems and does its own particular work. So now I have presented this scheme of various kinds of relationships and various kinds of categories. I want to come to the main part of this paper, which is the components of identity. I want to follow the call of an anthropologist, Rogers Brubaker, and a historian, Frederick Cooper, who have about 20 years ago in a famous article on identity, as it is called, asked historians and social scientists to break up the composite concept of identity into three main aspects, which I think is particularly useful for thinking about the identities of enslaved persons. The first aspect of identity is categorization. It's how people categorize other individuals, and it focuses on the external aspect of this process. How other people categorize me is what the process of categorization is like. Self-understanding focuses on the internal aspect of this process, the way individuals understand themselves. Now, both categorization and self-understanding are necessary and unavoidable aspects of any form of identity and any form of identification. People are aware how they self-identify and how they categorize other people, and they can be equally aware of how other people self-identify and how other people categorize themselves. Although there can be significant cleavages between categorization and self-understanding. I might think of myself as a Greek citizen of Albanian origins, but other people might treat me simply as an Albanian. I might think of myself, I might be unaware of how other people, in fact, categorize me. I might think of myself as a very clever person, while the other people categorize me as being stupid. How other people categorize me might come up to affect my own self-understanding. If people keep treating me as an Albanian, in the end, I might decide to stop thinking of myself as a Greek citizen of Albanian origins and self-identify, self-understand as an Albanian. Or I might convince other people to treat me in the way I understand myself. Now, while all identities partake of categorization and self-understanding, a third element, that of groupness, affects only certain kind of identities and not all identities. The first two elements are necessary in all forms of identities, but the third one, groupness, the creation of group identities, is something which is a potential and in fact happens in practice only for certain forms of identity. Now, categorization is essential for groupness. Without a category of particular people, that cannot happen. Self-understanding is equally necessary. The category of blue-eyed people who speak French is absolutely legitimate as a category, but unless those people understand themselves as blue-eyed people who speak French, it's a category that doesn't have an effect on their own self-understanding. But in order to have groupness, we need categorization, we need self-understanding, but we also need what we can say, we can define as networking. Shared activities, shared actions between at least a number of people who belong to a particular category and a particular form of self-understanding. So I want to look at the implications of these three aspects for the identity of enslaved people. As I mentioned in the beginning, slavery is an imposed identity. It's an act of categorization. Certain people are categorized as slaves, and clearly, given the asymmetries of power in all slaveholding societies, that has a significant impact on their identities. In fact, a significant number of slaves in slaveholding societies end up adopting that form of categorization and see themselves primarily as slaves. But I think it should be a mistake to take that act of categorization as the beginning and the end of the story. Firstly, because there is a potential for a significant disjuncture between the categorization of people as slaves and how the people categorized as slaves understood and saw themselves. Slaves, in fact, had a variety of identities apart from the imposed identity of being slaves. One particularly important is that of thinking of themselves as free people in captivity. In one of the fascinating cases reported by Demosthenes during the Peloponnesian War, the father of the speaker in that particular case, Euxithius, was captured and spent a significant part of his life as a slave in the island of Leucas. In fact, he stayed there for such a long time that when he ultimately came back to Athens, he had adopted the local accent of Leucas, and many people thought he was actually not Athenian. I think it's quite likely that the father of Euxithius, in all his years as a slave in Lefkas, would of course have to accept to some extent his categorization as slave, because that would affect his everyday reality in all sorts of ways. But at the same time, it is, I think, quite likely that his main understanding of himself was as a free Athenian in captivity, and that would have had a significant effect on his identity and on his actions. We don't often come across autobiographies of slaves in antiquity, but the two closest examples we have, which is the Life of Malchus by Jerome and St. Patrick's Confession, are cases in which their pre-existing Christian identity plays a very particular role in how they conceptualize themselves while in captivity, as well as in how they decide, at least according to their narratives, to get out of captivity and successfully return to their origins. To give another example, which I think is particularly telling about the fact that a significant number of ancient slaves probably saw themselves as free people in captivity, I give you a passage from Achilles Statius' novel, Leucippe and Clitophon. As with all Greek novels, Leucippe is the free heroine who comes from a noble family and who goes through various travails. At some point, she becomes a slave, and her master, Thersanthros, is trying to seduce her and instigate sexual relationships with her. After she keeps refusing, she decides to enforce his rights as a master and threatens to violate her. And this is Leucippe's answer to that threat. Arm yourself again. Take up your whips against me, the torture wheel, the fire, the iron blade. Have your counselor too, Sosthenes, fight by your side. I, naked, alone, a woman, I have one weapon, my freedom. But freedom cannot be beaten up by blows, nor cut up with iron blades, nor burnt in fire. I will never surrender it. Even if you set me on fire, you will find that fire is not as hot. Now, the claim of Leucippe here that her erstwhile freedom will save her is, of course, absurd in a realistic sense. It only makes sense in the context of an ancient novel where the reader knows that in the end, the heroine is going to be saved and be happily reunited with her future husband. But it's precisely this absurdity, I think, which makes quite obvious the significance of realizing the number of slaves who thought of themselves as free people in captivity. Now, apart from that, we have to equally take account, I think, all the other identities that slaves formed beyond and below their existence as slaves. To start with, their various ethnic identities, both those that pre-existed their enslavement and those that were constructed in the course of their experience of enslavement. Slaves also they created families and kinship groups, and therefore they had identities as fathers, mothers, children, relatives, ancestors, and descendants. Thirdly, slaves had professional identities. Many slaves, apart from working for their own masters in a variety of capacities, many slaves worked on their own in the service sector as petty traders, as petty merchants, as agricultural tenants, and so on and so forth. And they often participated in groups on the basis of their professional identity. Slaves, of course, had also cultic identities, both cultic identities that pre-existed their enslavement and cultic identities that they experienced or created in the course of their life in slavery. One could multiply the examples, but I think I'm not going to focus so much on examples, but I think it's quite important to recognize the variety of identities that slaves had apart from their identity as slaves. This brings us to the matter which is quite relevant for the alternative definition of slavery, the definition of slavery as social death that was introduced by Orlando Patterson in his famous book, Slavery and Social Death. Patterson defined slaves as natally alienated and dishonored individuals, and by that he meant, of course, that slaveholding societies, he didn't mean that slaves do not have families and kissing groups and various other identities. What he meant is that slaveholding societies do not recognize those identities as legally and socially consequential. Famously, to take the example of Roman law, slaves, of course, had families, but legally these families were not legally recognized. They were contubernia, people who lived together, rather than legitimate marriages. So if you take Patterson's point of view, slaves might have all sorts of identities, but social death effectively meant that the only identity that mattered was the identity that came through their categorization as slaves. Everything else might have existed, but was historically insignificant. And I think over the last, in particular over the last decade, a number of works have started to lower the limits of Patterson's understanding of social death from a variety of points of view. I think there is something quite important in Patterson's conception of social death and its significance for slave identity, but we have to be more precise in how we conceptualize it and how we use it. The first thing is to make a distinction, which I think is quite important, between the interaction order of a society and its various arenas and the institutional order of a particular society. By the interaction order, I mean the various arenas in which people come into to interact with other people, work, family, cult, travel, and so on and so forth. And by the institutional order, I mean effectively the state, the law, the political and legal institutions of a particular society. I think it's quite important to realize that in many societies, what applies to the interaction order does not necessarily mean that it also applies to the institutional order. Take the case of slaves who work on their own, a significant number of slaves in many ancient societies, in a variety of professional capacities. In order to be able to function fruitfully as professionals and to create profits both for themselves as well as their masters, it is quite important that they are treated by the people they come to interact with, primarily in their professional capacities and secondarily in their capacity as slaves. There's a quite interesting example from Pseudo-Xenophon's Constitution of the Athenians from 5th century BCE Athens, in which the speaker uses the persona of somebody who is adamant against the democratic Athenian society, but at the same time tries to reveal its sociological logic. If anyone is also surprised at the fact that that here they allow their slaves to live in luxury, and some of them magnificently, they could be shown to be doing this too with good reason. For where there is naval power, it is necessary to be a slave to one's slaves for the money, so that we may be taking the slaves' earnings and to let them be free. But in Lacedaemon, in Sparta, my slave feared you. But if your slave fears me, there will be a risk that he even offers his money so as not to be in danger. Where there are wealthy slaves, it is no longer to my benefit that my slave should fear you. This is why we established that the slaves too have equal rights to free speech as the free and the metics as the citizens. Now, it's important to remember this is a critique of Athenian society, which is, of course, prone to exaggeration. But the logic of the passage, I think, can be distinguished from the use to which it is put. These slaves who work on their own and therefore can accrue profits which provide revenue for their masters need to be treated in this particular way, which is described in the passage, to function in the best possible way. But the fact that in the interaction arena of the market exchange, they are treated primarily as professionals and secondarily or very little as slaves doesn't necessarily mean that in other arenas, the arena of cult, the arena of commensality and so on, they will also be treated in this way and not as slaves. What is almost automatic for free people to retain the same kind of identity across different arenas of the interaction order is something that the slaves actually had to struggle in order to achieve. And what is also the case for the institutional order, the fact that the various identities of free persons can be recognized both in the interaction order, but also in the institutional order, is not necessarily the case for enslaved people. While enslaved people in the interaction order might be treated as professionals, as devotees of Artemis, as members of an ethnic group, as accomplice individuals, in the institutional order of the legal system, for example, it might be the case that the only identity that mattered was their identity as slaves. That's why I think that the call of a modern historian, Vincent Brown, about 10 years ago, to reconceptualize social death, not as some kind of transhistorical essence of slavery, but as a matter of fact, as an existential threat that slaves in slaveholding societies continuously faced, but which they tried to deal with in one way or the other, and with greater or lesser success, is a much better way of accepting what is useful in Patterson's concept of social death, and what is misleading because of the essentialist logic of Patterson's work. Last thing, not all institutional orders make the various identities of enslaved persons invisible. Islamic societies, for example, recognize the marriage between free and slave people, and the marriage of slave persons, recognize it legally and as having legal consequences. If we look at the ancient world, if you look at wording in ancient Crete, for example, slaves didn't have the right to marry, but their marriages had legal consequences. The children of slave marriages belonged to the master of the father rather than the master of the husband, or the guardian of the woman rather than the master of the woman. So even if you take one example, the example of marriage, the extent to which institutional orders recognize the various identities of slaves can differ to a very significant degree from one society to the other, and that's something that we need to take into account. Now, I think this is getting to a particular kind of argument. Slaves had a variety of identities apart from their slave identity. A significant part of slave agency was exercised in individual terms because it was particularly difficult for slaves to act collectively. I don't think I need to go into details in that respect. I would argue that a very significant part of slave groupness concerned identities apart from their identity as slaves. A significant part of slave groupness concerned their identities as family members, as professionals, as members of an ethnic group, as members of a religious group, and so on and so forth. So where does that leave the groupness of enslaved persons qua slaves? I think it's quite interesting that there's quite a significant disparity between Greek and Roman societies in that respect. And here we come back to the distinction between categorical and relational modes of identification that I was talking about in the early part of the paper. It's very rare to see slaves acting as a group in the Greek sources, while it is quite common to see that sort of thing in the Latin, in the Roman sources. And one reason for that is the significance of the relational mode of the identification, the stress on the particular relationship between a master and his slaves, which is so visible in Latin sources, but so invisible in Greek sources. One can find multiple examples from the Latin sources of the Western Mediterranean. I think one can count, if not in the fingers of two hands, something very close to that. Most of the cases in which we see slave identification and slave groupness in the Greek sources concern the early imperial period, and most of them concern, in fact, the slaves of Roman masters. I will give you two examples, and I will finish with them. The first one comes from Chester in Britain. It's an inscribed altar to Fortune, the home bringer, to Aesculapius and to Salus, the freedmen and slaves, the familia, of Titus Pomponius Mamilianus, Rufus Antistianus, Funizulanus Vetonianus, son of Titus, of the Galerian voting tribe, imperial legate, gave and dedicated this. This is a monument set up by the freedmen and the slaves of a Roman imperial official. And clearly, this is an example of slave groupness. These slaves act together in order to honor their master, but they act together because they have one connecting link. They are all slaves or former slaves of one particular and, in fact, quite important master. Previous inscription was in Latin. This inscription comes from early imperial Miletus in Asia Minor, and in fact, it is in Greek. But as you will see, has quite a strong Roman context. Tiberius Julius Frugi Damianus, son of Titus Damianus, chief priest of the province of Asia, member of the tribe Cornelia, the familia honors its own master. Familia is a Latin term to describe, among other things, the group of slaves belonging to a single master. Here, the Greek inscription has transliterated the term familia. There's no equivalent Greek term, and of course the slaves here honor their own master, despite the fact that this is a Greek inscription. Not only is the master a Roman citizen, but also the use of Latin terms shows how much this particular form of slave groupness has a Latin and Roman coloration, let's say. So here we clearly come across a form of slave groupness, but it's a slave groupness that I would argue is in fact limited in the sense that its common theme, belonging to the slave familia, having the same master, does not make it easily expendable to groups of slaves or former slaves who belong to different masters. The columbaria, the resting places, the burial places of the members of the family of big, great aristocratic Roman families in Rome is, of course, the most typical example of this phenomenon, something that is effectively absent from the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean. So, to try to sum up, enslaved persons had a variety of identities. And it's quite significant for scholarship to try to grapple seriously with the various identities of enslaved persons. Clearly, being slaves was one of those identities, but there were various other identities. And in fact, I would argue that one of the most important struggles in the history of slavery was to try to create as big a distance between two forms of identity: the nominal identity of being a slave and the actual identity of how enslaved persons actually live their lives, and the extent to which other relationships, apart from slavery, their family relationships, their professional relationships, their ethnic, religious, and other relationships affected as many aspects of their lives as possible. it's a theme that could help us to create a history of slavery in antiquity in which the agency of enslaved persons and their multiple identities would be an active historical force rather than the passive way in which ancient slaves are usually treated in global accounts of ancient slavery. Thank you very much.